Well, thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. I've been studying children and youth, the sociology of children and youth crime and justice, pretty much my whole academic career. And this presentation, then, is the culmination of all of that work, and with a focus on human rights. I'm just finishing a book for a Canadian publisher on an About Canada series and kids, and this is the framework of that book. And I wanted to present it to you and give you some time at the end to respond, because it's Canada's report card on human rights and children and youth is not very good, believe it or not, for such an affluent country, a country that's ranked one of the top countries in the world in which to live. Our report card is not good, and I wanted to share that with you and to get your feedback. I should mention before I start, too, that a lot of this work, a lot of the empirical work in here is the result of Karen Charlebois' amazing research talents. So, so if you disagree with something, if you disagree with something I have here, she did it. So it's a human rights discussion, a discussion about civil liberties and children in Canada, and basic civil liberties like the right to a decent standard of living, the right to participate in the democratic process, and we don't allow that here very much at all. And because we don't allow it at young ages, it translates into apathy for young people well into their 30s in the democratic process. The right to engage in safety and security in the labor and enterprise. It's amazing how the labor rights of children and youth are not upheld in Canada, and the rights of adults are. The right to counsel, the access to justice, a fundamental human right. We actually deny that to children and youth in the youth justice system, although formally we're not supposed to. The right to protection from exploitation, that's a fundamental human right, which we'll see is violated. Freedom of expression, and the right to place and space. And these two last ones I'll discuss towards the end, but they're so fundamentally important that the public space is shrinking in the world, and children and youth are sloughed off to the margins, excuse me, to the margins of that public space. So the framework then is a discussion of basic freedoms. The first one is freedom from privation, the freedom from poverty. And there's some empirical evidence of how we stack up relative to selected countries throughout the world. In 1989, the government declared through Bill C-45 that we would eliminate poverty by 2000. We didn't do it. And we have had subsequent bills to declare that in a certain few years we'll eliminate poverty. Well, actually, Canada's poverty rate has, amongst children and youth, has, relative to other countries, has become poorer and poorer. You can see the Scandinavian countries do very well. Mexico and the US do fairly poorly, but we don't do much better. We're right in there with Turkey and Poland, and a little bit worse than Australia. The second issue is the same understanding of poverty within the geography of Canada. And the subtext there is, like countries, it is not necessarily the poorer provinces that have high child poverty. We all know about BC. BC keeps coming up as the highest rates of child poverty in all the provinces in Canada. And as you can see there, BC and Manitoba. Saskatchewan is high, New Brunswick is high. Have-not provinces like BC are quite high. Have provinces like BC are high. Have provinces like Alberta are high as well. There's an interesting anomaly in Alberta. Alberta consistently has low rates of child poverty, and yet people in Alberta talk about the hidden poverty. In places like Fort McMurray, where poverty is judged by the per capita income, people who earn $15,000, $16,000, $70,000 in McMurray live below the poverty line in Fort McMurray. So Alberta has this whole pocket of industrialization where poverty is actually hidden because of the high wages and the extremely high cost of living. The social face of poverty, and these are things I'm sure that most of you know, and I'll go through them briefly, but 33% of immigrant children live below the poverty line, 28% of First Nations kids, visible minority children, 26%, non-visible minority children, 12%. The racial dimension of poverty in this country is astounding, and I mean, part of it is the historical explanation. I suppose institutionalized racism is part of it. It's hard to see how that works, but it has to be something. But there's the reality that we need to look at. The fundamental issues then regarding poverty, the income gradient, poorer kids have poorer health, they have poorer teeth, they're more obese, they have poor nutrition, low educational success, greater contact with the legal system, more behavioral problems, greater risk of victimization, both formal and informal. Poor kids do very poorly in the world relative to rich kids, and it's hard to figure out why, but this presentation hopefully will shed some light on that. It's not unusual to realize that family type has an influence on poverty rates. 70% of single women working full-time in Canada live below the poverty line. It's hard to believe. In Sweden and Denmark, the rates are 5 to 8%. Countries that are very much alike ideologically we probably have greater resources, but we have the same sort of social justice history, and yet our rates of poverty related to family type are amazing compared to theirs. And we have working poor in this country. 25% of Canadians who are working full-time fall well below the poverty level. And that's not true in the Scandinavian countries. Something about are these debates over minimum wage are actually specious debates. Raising the minimum wage from $10 to $11 an hour means absolutely nothing. There's a guaranteed income that needs to be discussed, and the Scandinavian countries do it. France does it somewhat. We don't at all. It frightens us to think about a guaranteed income supplement. The second freedom, the freedom from ill health. If you look at selected countries, we have universal health care. We should do very well. We certainly don't do too badly, although we don't do as well as we should. We actually are right in line with the United Kingdom, a little bit better than Cuba, quite a bit better than the United States. But our infant mortality rates have grown dramatically. We used to be 6th in the world. If you look at the ranking now, we're 36th. Now that's also because other countries have done a better job of prevention of infant mortality, but we haven't kept pace, and it makes you question why in a system of universal health care. Cuba's a bit of an anomaly. They have the best healthcare system in the world and the best doctors. That's partly why they do so well. The same prevention of infant mortality across the provinces in Canada. This is where BC comes out fairly well. But you can see that the poor areas of Canada, like Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, is not bad. Nunavut, the Yukon, provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Newfoundland and Labrador. Provinces where in the northern communities there is a lot of poverty, and that translates into infant mortality. As I said, BC seems to do quite well. I wanted to show you this next slide, though. It's I did some work on hospitalization rates in children and youth as an indication of child health. And most of these affluent cities, like Vancouver and Calgary, Toronto and London, kids don't go to the hospital very much at all. And cities like Regina and Halifax, and they're fairly affluent cities as well, but they have these pockets of poverty. Kids go to the hospital a lot. Look at the substantial difference, and the substantial difference between socioeconomic status as well, too. And I certainly like to hear your comments at the end, but part of it is need. When you go through downtown Regina, you can see the absolute healthcare needs, and the hospital system is pretty good there, so kids do go to the hospital. And so it's a matter of need and availability of facilities as well. Regina's facilities are quite good. I'm assuming Halifax's are quite good as well. So it's a bit of an anomalous chart, but I thought I'd throw it in anyway. The fundamental issues of health, socioeconomic status, there's no denying that poor kids have poorer health in all categories. But I wanted to discuss this a little bit with you, this notion of geographical isolation and malnourishment. There's a wonderful book called The Last Shot, City Streets and Basketball Dreams, and it was written several years ago about Coney Island. Coney Island used to be Coney Island. But now it's projects for relatively poor, mostly African-American families. Coney Island has something like 50,000 people in it. And this story is really about how young black kids get to be famous basketball players or gang members. Those are the two occupational styles. What I found most interesting about the story is that in Coney Island, there are no grocery stores. There are 8 McDonald's, 7 7-Elevens, and some Burger Kings, but no grocery stores. For parents to buy fresh groceries, they have to travel an hour and a half there and back by train to get groceries. In Toronto, new work has shown that Toronto is somewhat like that as well too. They call them food deserts in Toronto. Pockets of the inner city where you can't buy fresh food. It's true in Regina, it's true in Saskatoon as well too. Grocery stores leave the inner cities and they're replaced by McDonald's and Burger King and 7-Eleven foods that have no nourishment at all. Connected with this then is the, come on. Connected with that is the idea of fast food and child and parental obesity. 95% of kids in North America recognize Ronald McDonald, 94% recognize Santa Claus. Ronald McDonald is the most recognized figure in North America. And when kids visit McDonald's and other fast food restaurants, they ingest sugar and fat. The quadrupling of consumption of cola in North America in the last 40 years. Now, why have I told you that? Well, in Oregon, where I've had a chance to spend some time and to do some work, a lot of young Hispanic couples who both work and have 3 or 4 children and suffer from extremely high rates of obesity. They live in areas where there are a lot of fast food chains, and you can buy a Carl Jr.'s burger or a Jack in the Box burger for $1 and a Coke for 50 cents. They're able to buy food that their children crave, by the way, because of advertising. They're able to buy food much, much more cheaply than they are to prepare food. And when they're both working, it's the only way they have to survive. It's creating a wave of malnourishment in Canada and the United States because the food is so cheap, so poor, and so accessible, and so tied to popular culture. And it's actually an epidemic of a lifestyle epidemic and a popular cultural epidemic that I'll talk about again in a few minutes. It's not working at all. Are you okay sitting there, Vanessa? Okay. The sedentary e-world, and I think this is something where we haven't thought through the development of the internet and the development of the e-world very well, and we haven't thought through it certainly in terms of child and human rights. It's the easy road to education. Schools are adopting this technology just like that, and they're adopting not only the online learning, and I'm talking about primary and secondary schools, but they're also adopting it as the epitome of good education. Overnight they've done it. It's created then a sedentary population of kids that I'll discuss again, that really is removed from the real world. And the average kid in North America, believe it or not, spends 11 hours a day in front of some sort of electronic device. Now, it's not 11 actual hours, it's 11 multitasked hours. So kids will be in front of the TV and emailing and being on their phones 11 hours per day, and that means they're spending virtually no time doing anything else other than school and their electronic time. It's creating then a population of kids that people like Richard Love, who was here actually a while ago, Last Child in the Woods, talks about a crisis, an epidemic crisis. And this is the epidemic crisis. When you remove kids from nature and expose them to a world where you attach their success to being in front of the computer and having electronic skills, you actually remove them from the real world to their own health detriment. The last issue I wanted to talk about in the area of health is this one, and it's actually probably the most important one because it's the one that drives public policy, I believe. There are 2 myths regarding the sexual health, the sexual exploitation of children and youth. The first myth is that kids are sexually out of control, and it drives a lot of our public policy, and it drives a lot of the health policy and crime criminal justice policy that kids are sexually active, they're sexually more volatile than, and they're spreading disease. Well, it's actually not true. Sexual activity amongst kids has been down quite a bit in the last few years. The first sexual encounter, the age of first sexual encounter has gone up by almost 2 years since the 1980s. So there's the warnings about STDs and about AIDS have actually sunk in with kids, and they're actually more responsible than my generation, way more responsible than my parents' generation, where everybody got married because they had to. So that myth, which drives public policy, is accompanied by another myth. And the other myth is that children need to be protected from the world because there are sexual predators out there, and that we need to street-proof them, and we need to create a justice system that goes after sexual predators. Well, sexual predation by strangers is extremely rare, almost non-existent. But what is fairly common is sexual predation by intimates and by people in positions of authority. And I think one of the things that's happened to our system of understanding children and youth and families is that we've exonerated certain types of child abuse and focused on other types of child abuse that are not as important. And we've made bad public policy as a result. If you looked at Stephen Harper's victimization ads in the last month on TV, this new program where the government is spending money to make sure that victims' rights are assured, and he talks about, and those ads talk about danger from strangers, etc. Well, that's actually not very true at all. The real danger is from people in residential schools and from people in positions of authority in other kinds of schools, people in families where the real types of victimization occurs. We have not focused on that very much at all. We've focused on the other kinds of victimizations, and the question is why. Well, we can address that at the end, but part of the reason is it's good politics to do that. And Harper knows very well, as did George Bush, probably as does Barack Obama as well. Right, the freedom from legal discrimination, and here's the one that I've worked most of my academic career on, the youth justice for children and youth, and here's where we don't stack up very well at all. We lock up more kids per capita than any other industrialized country in the world, by far. America locks up more adults than we do, by the way, so it tapers off for the adult system, but in the youth justice system, we do that. Now, why do we do it? I think we do it in part because it's historical habit. We just got in the habit of doing it and couldn't stop, although Quebec stopped. And BC's not bad either. Norway, it's not Norway, it is Sweden, I believe, locked up last year 5 young offenders, the whole year in the whole country. They just don't use the justice system at all. They found a better way, and their society is as safe or safer than Canada's, by all means.
Adjusted population, that would be 20 people here.
20. Yeah, that's a good point, Marilyn. Yeah, nobody, virtually. Yeah. If you look at incarceration rates by province, if you just isolate the provinces, the territories do very, very poorly because they're sort of a young jurisdiction and they haven't sort of the historical background that the provinces have. But if you look at the provinces, Saskatchewan locks up more young offenders than any other jurisdiction almost in the world. And when you go to Saskatchewan, it's an ordinary province. It looks fairly affluent and it doesn't look dangerous, but we got in the historical habit of locking up kids, as did Manitoba. BC is quite good. The poverty rates in BC are high, but the youth of the criminal justice system is low. So BC has sort of come out of that, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba remain in that loop where it's just what we do when kids break the law. Marilyn?
Yeah, just when you talk about incarceration, are you talking about only prisons, or are you talking about like group homes for kids as well as prisons?
These rates are incarceration. They end up in group homes, but in Saskatchewan, the prisons and the group homes are one and the same thing. Yeah, they're virtually the same.
So some of this can be actually almost protected.
Yeah, well, and that's the theory of all youth justice systems, that they're in protective custody, by all means, yeah. But But I've been in the custodial institutions in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and they're just jails. They have good programs, or so they say, but they're jails. They lock the doors behind the kids when they go to bed. And, yeah. So anyway, that's a snapshot of Canada. Okay. Here's the astounding one, and the issue of race is so at the front of our violation of the civil liberties of Aboriginal people, especially in terms of incarcerating kids, is well, it's shameful, and it's again that historical habit, I think, that went back probably 200 years, and we haven't gotten out of the loop. And part of it is the institutions are there, and you fill the institutions if they're there. One of the things that Stephen Harper is doing, and I object to it categorically, is he's building new prisons in BC. Well, he's saying we're building them for the bad guys, and that the occasional criminals, we'll treat them fine, but the reality in North America is when you build jails, you fill them up. Just, that's what happens. And I think that's what happens in these historical conditions in some of these provinces. But the First Nations kids, it's amazing, actually. The fundamental issues then, the first issue is that most kids in jail are there for minor offenses. They're for systems offenses, or for drug offenses, or for violence in school. Schools channel, most kids that go into the criminal justice system are channeled there through the school system. The race issue is there, as we just discussed. The gender issue, you lock up way more boys than girls per capita, way more. Girls get off when the cops arrest them, or when they're treated more gently by the justice system. Boys aren't. And it's probably the stereotype of gender that's embedded in policing and the courts and all of that. Yeah, this is an amazing issue too. I don't know if there's much more to be said about this, except that kids in certain areas go to prison. Kids in inner cities, Saskatoon and Regina, and I'm sure that's true of Vancouver as well. It's certainly true of Calgary and Edmonton. Kids in the inner city are overrepresented in the jail system, much more than their suburban counterparts. And ironically, in cities in Saskatchewan, the suburbs have the highest vandalism rates and the highest property crime rates of anywhere else in the city. And yet the kids in the inner city go into the system. And it's not that the police want to throw them in jail, it's that the police find them in need, and the jail is the only place where they know to send them. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who's the children's advocate for the province here, was a youth court judge in Saskatoon for years when I was there. And Mary Ellen kept saying to the system, build facilities so we don't have to send kids to jail. We can build halfway houses and group homes. And she would refuse to send kids to jail, and other judges hated her for that. They hated her for the fact that she wasn't using the justice system like it was supposed to. What she was doing is forcing the province to build those facilities, which they never did. And I think she's in the same kinds of battles here. You probably heard her on CBC yesterday morning. She's doing the same kind of good work here. Whenever you go into a youth justice facility, and this is where this human rights thing probably coalesced in my mind more than anywhere else, you go into a youth justice facility, the kids, the first thing you notice is poor health. You don't notice that they're criminal, aggressive, mean, nasty, impolite, or anything. You notice that they have poor teeth and poor skin, that they're underweight or they're overweight, that they're tired. They're just in really poor health. And somehow, in all of those institutions, we've equated criminality with poor health. The criminal justice issue that we think we have with youth is not a criminal justice issue at all. It's a health issue. And our governments refuse to use the discourse of health when talking to them, talking about them, especially in political campaigns. And lastly, it's important to know that prisons don't correct. They call them corrections. Prisons are often siphons into the adult system, especially in provinces where there are a lot of gang members. Okay. The next issue, the freedom from labor discrimination. Yeah, most kids want to work. And actually in my writing, I argue that they should be able to work. The problem is, and you can see the problem in the next slide. there are some of the problems, and I'll let you read them for a second. That, if you go to the next slide, Vanessa. When you read that, you'll see that, in effect, what happens when kids work, they have no labor rights protections. When they work in the fast food industry, my sons both worked in the fast food industry, both at McDonald's. They both burned themselves, and they both had friends burn themselves. McDonald's sends them home, and when they're healed, they can come back to work. Those are the labor protections they have. They work below the minimum wage level. In Alberta now, Alberta's declared that 12-year-olds can be employed below the minimum wage level. Alberta did it because there's a shortage of labor in the service industry in Alberta. But so they certainly do that. There's an insidious irony in the fast food industry and the clothing industry with kids too. They end up being very compelled to take the money that they earn, like spending money, and spending it in the industries where they work. They actually, in many ways, work for free. It's almost a type of new form of slavery. McDonald's is a multinational corporation that's growing, growing, and growing. Their labor is almost free when you realize that kids turn around and spend their money back where they earned it. In those industries, and the fast food industry is typical, there's absolutely no mentoring of kids and very little training. In McDonald's, they learn on the job because it's expensive not to. In the adult world, training and mentoring is an absolute necessity. It's what I would consider a human right. It doesn't occur for kids. I called it a new form of free labor. It seems a bit dramatic, but I think that's absolutely true. And the explanations go back in our history. Back to Eggerson Ryerton and the development of residential schools and education for work and work for education. That we actually embedded the notion of children working for free in the development of residential schools, work schools, and poor schools. That coupled with the history of labor, there's a labor union antipathy to kids working in Canada. Labor unions hate the competition. They like the idea that kids need to be protected from the rigors of labor, the rigors of dangerous labor. So they use those two explanations to vigorously fight the incorporation of children and children's labor rights into the Canadian fabric. And I think they've made a terrible mistake over time, because kids work anyway. The right to learn, universal education, equal and adequate education for all children in Canada. One of my chapters deals with the fact that poor kids don't do well in school at all compared to their wealthier counterparts. Now, that's easy to see. Wealthy families provide more books, and there's a direct correlation between the number of books in the house and how your kids do in school. But there's a darker side to this too. It's just not that wealthy families can provide educational resources. And this is the dark side in the next slide. I argue in my writing that schools, their primary purpose is not to educate. Their primary purpose is to engage kids in schools and the educational process. That's their workplace. That's where they need to be engaged and develop their sense of enthusiasm towards the world. The education is secondary, it comes. But look what low school engagement does. The orange line is high school, the darker red line is the low school engagement, or medium school engagement. I haven't included low because low is off the chart. Kids who only have sort of average school engagement, greater alcohol use, greater tobacco use, greater marijuana use, greater contact with their criminal peers, and higher levels of anxiety, poorer health, and poorer self-esteem. Now, we've created schools to be, in my opinion, almost factory-like. We haven't done a good job of creating them as places where you want to spend time, although some schools are very good. Some alternative schools are great. They're expensive, but they're great. Is school engagement a student issue or an educational issue? I think in the paradigm of Canadian politics, kids who don't do well in school and are not engaged, they're to blame, or their parents are to blame, or their communities are to blame. I actually don't think that's true. I think school engagement is a foundational educational issue. I've worked with alternative schools in Saskatchewan. One in particular comes to mind. It's called One Ska Indian Cultural School in Prince Albert, and they only take street kids in their program, and their kids range in age between the ages of 11 and 29. So they have a whole range of students, and these are kids that are on the street, in jail, and they've never done well in school. One Ska physically gets them and brings them into school and leaves them there. And there's a whole series of programs for teaching and learning, cooking, etc., and they leave the school open 24 hours. Kids can stay there. They have almost reduced the recidivism rates of those kids to 0. Now, there's still a lot of damaged people in that group, but the school engagement has changed the lives of kids, and they don't teach them the 3 R's. They don't need that. They get that eventually, but that's how important the school engagement issue, and I think it's a fundamental human right to make sure that kids have an engaged place to be during the working day. That's their workplace, and we don't do it. And, sure. This scale, Isabel, was a whole series of things like how well you enjoy school. Do you get involved in school politics? Do you play sports? How many hours do you spend in school? How many days of school do you miss? So it's a whole scale of things that we would want our kids to do when they were in school. And yeah. Okay. Quality of education by geography. You can look at cities, drive through a city like Victoria and look at the schools and look at the communities. And Saskatoon is a typical example. The nice schools are in the nice communities, the rundown schools are in the poor communities. There's no reason why that's the case. That's public policy. And schools get reputations on the basis of how they look, and people send their kids to schools that look good. And that's a problem that we have not dealt with very well at all in this society. And it's widened the educational gap and ultimately the social gap between the haves and the have-nots. Dropout rates by geography, that goes without saying. There are 900 kids out of school in Saskatoon, and they all live in the inner city, almost all of them. Just a reality. I talked before, we looked at the chart before, school engagement has a direct impact on health. If you want healthier kids, make the schools more engaging. The problem with engaged schools, alternative schools, they're expensive to run. They do a lot of one-to-one mentoring. They do a lot of more mature students mentoring less mature students. The class sizes are small. The facilities have to be good. They are expensive. And we have this fundamental disbelief that education should be paid for when it's needed. We actually tie it to the tax rolls, and that's a problem for us, I believe. And alternative schools, as I said, their fundamental priority is engagement, not education. This freedom from corporate aggression, the links to school. This last one, I'm actually quite passionate about, and I'd be interested to hear your comments on this as well too. Because kids can't vote, I actually don't think that they should be exposed to the types of corporate aggression that we are exposed to. And maybe we have the experiential skills to realize that you should only eat at McDonald's once every week at the very most, otherwise you're not going to feel very well. But the idea of selling health, there's an interesting new body of research that looks at the geographical tracking of ADHD and ADD and the use of Ritalin and Dexedrine and other drugs for that. In the United States primarily, there's almost no diagnoses in the western states, and as you go east, it darkens and darkens and darkens all the way to the East Coast. The highest rates of ADD and ADHD are on the East Coast, and gradually they decrease all the way to the West. So, is there some geographical or epidemiological reason for that? Or is there something else going on? Well, one of the arguments that's been made in some of the research in Canada is that ADD and ADHD are diagnoses for kids who don't do well in school. And Ritalin and Dexedrine and those kinds of drugs can pacify kids and make them sit still. And I don't blame parents by any means, because even I as a parent wanted my kids to sit still in school, do well, have the teachers like them. and if they were anxious or hyperactive, teachers didn't do it. And so I don't blame parents, but the idea that health and education have colluded to treat lack of success in school and the lack of the inability to sit still in a class of 30, I think is actually morally wrong, although there's a lot of disagreement, and a lot of people would say that the reality out there is that there are kids who are anxious and hyperactive, and that is true. The other reality is, though, I've seen alternative schools deal with those kinds of kids in a different way. They spend a lot of time outside, they spend a lot of time with elders mentoring one-to-one, and they actually do pay attention when people pay attention to them, but they can't sit still in a class of 30. We haven't figured that out very well. Because the pharmaceutical response is easy, the other responses are hard and more expensive. The fast food industry has infiltrated itself into schools, and some people argue for good. The Pizza Hut Read It program, or Book It program in North America was given an award by Ronald Reagan's government. Kids would read a certain number of books, they'd keep a log of those books, and they would get passes to Pizza Hut for free pizzas, they and their families. And Pizza Hut gained a lot of credibility for helping American education. Coke, Pepsi, McDonald's, all are part of school funding. Future Shop, Apple, Sony, if you go to the third one, that's it. Future Shop, Apple, Sony, the World Wide Web. Canada was the first country in the world to adopt the policy of access to the World Wide Web for all of its students in school. We now have, the statistic is 5,000 teaching resources for secondary education in North America on the web. And those are for-profit teaching resources. So teachers can access them and use them as part of their curricula. And the internet, or the e-companies that are doing that, are very, very lucrative companies. And it seems like a good thing, actually, doesn't it? That kids can participate in all of that good e-world stuff. Just go to the last one. For-profit education in the United States and Canada, sorry, this is in the United States, has a budget larger than the military or social services. And that's for profit primary and secondary education resources. So those are private companies that are producing resources for the public school system. Rockstar and Red Bull sponsor school events in Canada and the United States. Health Canada declared Rockstar and Red Bull dangerous products for kids. But they insinuate themselves into the education system. I guess the question we have to ask, and I'll go to the fundamental issues to ask them. Should public education be the site of corporate advertising? Some people argue yes, some people argue no. Can you protect children from corporate advertising through government interference? And should you, if they can't vote? And that's the question that I leave. Do they have the right to do this? And they do in some respects, especially the e-companies have the right to dictate curriculum because they have the research money to prove that those curricula are effective. There's my problem. It prevents real apprenticeship. It prevents teachers from spending one-to-one time with kids and teaching them like our parents did about real world issues and real education. It sort of obviates that. And the last issue then, does education have a right to participate in the educational success of students? And they do dramatically now. Teachers send kids to doctors when they can't sit still in school. Is that the correct way to handle education and those who fail in the education system? So the theoretical arguments that I'll leave you with, that's it. How do we explain all of this? Well, one of the explanations could be that global politics and economics has a very lucrative consumer market and a very lucrative laborer market, but not a manager's market. So kids are a form of, as I said before, free labor for multinational corporations, They are amazing consumers. They're probably better consumers than we are, but they're never managers. They're never part of the democratic process. There's a human rights violation, and some people have talked about that. Yes, the general disenfranchisement of youth. We don't allow kids to vote, and I've argued that kids at the age of 12 should vote because they can work in Alberta. Why can't they vote? And you say that to politicians and public policy makers, and they look at you like you're on something yourself. The problem for the disenfranchisement of youth is they become apathetic until they're older. The paradigm of risk, and this is a discourse that I've critiqued in some of my writing. The paradigm of risk is a paradigm that looks at individual kids as at risk. Science can respond to them through medicine. Education responds to them through remedial programs. And criminality and law responds to them by locking them up. And there's a very strong connection between education, funneling kids into the criminal justice system. So why haven't we been able to break free of this paradigm of risk and say that, well, the real risk is a poor school that doesn't create an engaged system, or a criminal justice system that really doesn't look at the issue of health as the fundamental issue, but the issue of risk to society instead of risk to kids. It's a paradigm that we haven't escaped, and part of it is it's good politics not to. The fear of crime sells votes, quite clearly. Public and media discourse. Over the years, I've written 2 books on moral panics and what you see in the media. It's good business. It's good media business to sell individualized stories of bad kids. You hear it all the time in Victoria. But those are not the stories of kids. Those are the stories of very rare occasions when kids break the law. But they sort of frame the way that we see the criminality of children and youth in general. Here's an interesting theory. There's some American authors who've argued that when you deny children and youth civil liberty, civil liberties, you protect the wealth of the baby boom generation. You protect their retirement plans, you protect their investments by making sure that there's cheap labor for the fast food industry, which you can invest in. And public-private space. There's some really interesting work coming out of Canada. Shireen Razik, I believe, at OISE. Shireen talks about the notion of shrinking space, and as space shrinks, people at the margins are pushed to the sides of that space. When my kids were in school, they'd go to the malls at noon, and the mall owners and the mall securities would kick them out. These are typical middle-class kids. They didn't have that space. If they walked downtown, the police watched them. If they stayed in school, they were fine. Their space was shrunk to that. And when you look at after-hours activities for kids, after-hours activities mostly for adults, all the clubs and the things that we see in the city. So there's this notion of shrinking space and the privatization of space, which is an interesting theory as well, too. That's it, people. Thank you. So I'd be delighted to hear what you have to say. Sure.
A question about the Scandinavian countries having much better statistics to do with child poverty. And
sure.
All that kind of stuff. And do you think one of the problems within Canada is our federal system? It's an easy out to blame the other, whether it's a municipal or a provincial or federal level, at which the Scandinavian countries, because of their geography, don't have?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And when you look at all the horrible statistics out of the Northwest Territories, and part of it is, from a federal government's political standpoint, it's easy to give over to the provinces or the territories. And part of the problem is they escape the visibility of the entire world. Even they escape the visibility of the provinces themselves, because provincial capitals are centered in big cities. I think you're absolutely right. I applaud Victoria in many ways because the invisibility is not there. Victoria is quite unique in that regard. It's a city where the rich and the poor visibly interact, and I think whether that's a concerted policy or whether it just happens, and I think that's true in Scandinavia as well. I think you're quite right.
But Swedes pay, if I was a Swede, I'd pay my income tax to my local municipality. That is huge.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden it empowers the local communities in ways we're trickle down.
And that's the issue of visibility that we were just discussing. When the spending occurs at that level, Marilyn, you can't escape the reality that's in front of your face. When the spending occurs at the federal level, it's easy to do that. I wish we had a national Ministry of Education in Canada. Yep. Sure.
Well, in support of Marilyn, because you made such a wonderful comment, I mentioned that you were well agreed with by Joseph Howe from 1867, prior to the Confederation of Canada, who made the very same argument. It was good then, and it's good today.
It's good today.
That's the Nova Scotia side out of the way now. I just would like to question, I didn't understand or challenge a couple
Of course, sure.
seem to be implicit assumptions.
Okay.
One is that children are like adults, and children are up to a certain age, seemingly growing older from when I was one, but somewhere in around the 18, 25 years old, there is a poorly developed sense of decision making, which we can track in the psychological evolution and development of children. So when we say that they're being disenfranchised, maybe they're being protected more than disenfranchised, more partially so.
Yeah.
Second point is to be poor is to be unhealthy, and you've got the stats there, and hopefully that's today. Because I remember as a youth, being poor wasn't a big deal. Being poor was something you were happy in, you were healthy in. You didn't have much, that's for sure, and you made good use of it. But there was a different attitude, so there might be an opportunity to take your research and flip back 50 years and look at what would the same questions asked of the population 50 years ago tell you that might actually inform what has changed, what is going wrong in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
That's
It's an interesting comment, Sherman. Well, certainly poverty is relative, and the relative poverty back then was not as severe as it is now. We know the gap between the rich and the poor is growing historically. And back in the day, I suppose, when everybody was relatively well off, but relatively not well off as well, the distinctions didn't.
We're not well off in Nova Scotia.
Well, and the distinctions didn't translate into privilege or lack of privilege.
No.
And that's what happens today. And the rights argument that children need to be protected, well, they're not. That's the argument. If we have a human rights argument that the developmental stage of 12 years old is not a stage that we want to trust with the democratic decision, then we better make sure that we're not using that underdeveloped person in some of these ways. And Karen?
From what Sherman was saying, that maybe 50 years ago, the percentage of poor people who lived in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. Because I think that what we're seeing is a greater percentage of people in urban areas, children in urban areas, and then the problems that Sherman was mentioning, lack of fresh produce.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
lack of your families can't access a supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
Some downtown areas, Saskatoon, Mission, Regina.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Karen. Yeah. Right?
Thanks for the presentation, Bernard.
Sure.
Looking at your statistics with the international comparisons and the national comparisons, there seems to be, from a quick look at it, a pretty strong correlation between places with high Aboriginal populations and bad records.
Yeah.
So a lot of the statistics are driven by
Yeah.
Aboriginal
Yeah.
populations. Have you seen, looking internationally, or is there any place where people are, have found some kind of a solution to what is such a huge problem? Are there any good examples out there where some progress is being made?
Yeah. One qualification, right? In Toronto, it's the Caribbean Canadian population. It's the black population in Toronto is the same way. But New Zealand is an interesting example. New Zealand, the Maori people in New Zealand have kept control of the tourism economy fairly well, and their rates of child poverty are less than ours considerably. Child crime is way less than ours considerably. But it's an interesting issue that it's almost a universal problem, right? And that's why I said there's something about historical habit and the treatment of different kinds of people. It's embedded in the systems. But there are, New Zealand comes to mind, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you very
Sure.
much for what I found to be a very uncomfortable presentation.
Well,
Really, because you bring so many things to light. And sitting here, personally having grown up in Regina,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
being completely aware of,
What goes on?
Tracks me on.
Oh, yeah.
And being a single parent of a teenage daughter.
Yeah.
And having gone through for teaching and having been a teacher in Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Yeah.
Having a wonderful philosophical conversation with the principal of my daughter's high school at Oak Bay. We talked about 21st century education and innovative learning practices and how to infuse those into the classroom. He was very excited about that, and we talked very idealistically about that. But then, in the conversation, the reality hit home for him as a high school administrator within the K-12 system, that really, even though people want innovative learning practices infused into the K-12 system, the reality is such that the system does not want to change. And so, especially if people obey, what I find too is that change is difficult. People want the same, only in obey. People expect the same, and so you must have a classroom with rows. And so, in your research around education in the K-12 system, are there any loopholes or any cracks in that wall where we can start to infuse more innovative learning for those populations at risk for engagement?
Mm-hmm. Diane, yeah, but it doesn't involve education, formal education. I'm actually surprised you say that they're fairly non-adoptive of new technologies, because schools actually adopted e-technology fairly quickly. But in regard to the sort of places where that have some good insights, there's a couple of the alternative schools and a couple of the community schools that we've looked at in Saskatchewan focus on physical activity, for one. The right to sports programs that have been embedded in some of the alternative schools work very well. Now, that's not education. That's something else, but it's about school engagement. So there is that. One school, cultural school in Prince Albert, and you've probably been to Prince Albert and you know what it's like there. Prince Albert is a very troubled city, but this school takes, what they've done is they've gone and stolen the best teachers in the system, and they get dedicated teachers. They rob them from other schools and embed them in this school, and they teach 24 hours a day. So there's a solution as well that works, but can you create a system of education where mentoring is the norm and not the exception anymore? One-to-one mentoring or 1-to-5 mentoring, however it occurs? I think you can do it, but I don't think Oak Bay is prepared to do that, to bring elderly folks into the school and help kids learn the realities of life at the expense of learning mathematics by new internet programs.
What's fascinating in Oak Bay is that, I mean, observationally, it's a very affluent city, and yet, if I look at I'm looking at Mary because our daughters are friends and are the same grade, and so maybe, you have a similar perspective. I look at Emma, and I see the work that they're doing and the work that they're not doing, and I think that it's the same when I went to high school, that it was really just a focus on books, and it wasn't the use of new technologies or it's the status quo, and that's what I'm talking about. Is there any crack in the system, whereby teaching practices can be refreshed? And unfortunately, what I heard from the principal of Oak Bay was that the teachers don't necessarily want to refresh teaching practices, because what they do is they teach how they were taught.
I was just going to say that, and it's extremely hard to retool teachers into the e-world, because kids are better at it than teachers. They always will be. So it actually puts teachers at a disadvantage in terms of their authority and their educational levels.
I realized a few years ago when I had was involved with some people that were looking at social housing and the so-called social low-income housing. They had dishwashers, which was at the time a shock to me, because I still don't have a dishwasher. I don't define that as. I was quite shocked, sorry folks, to find out that people at the level of poverty could expect a dishwasher in their social housing unit. That was a shock to me. It still kind of is because I don't have one, but, whatever. So I realized back then that I don't have a really good handle on what poverty actually is. Because it is obviously it was a very relative thing that I couldn't relate to, right? And it's same as you cite, I don't know, Grand Prairie or Port McMurray or something like that, where, the poverty level is $6 grand a year.
Yeah.
So I don't think maybe poverty rates are really where the focus should be then, but what should be the focus is child rights, as you say.
Yeah.
The right to a free and unfettered way of moving through the world until you reach the age of reason and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
I agree.
Freedom from that corporate influence, and I would add religious influence and all kinds of aggression like that.
I would agree very much. Even in poor communities, they absolutely have to have access to fresh food, and they don't. If they're poor and if that's the best our economy can give, then we must absolutely demand that people have access to those kinds of facilities. Yeah, I agree. Vanessa?
I'm just conscious of the time, and
Sure.
I wanted to thank you so much, Bernard, for your talk, but I'm sure he'd be willing to take more comments later.
Sure, well, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. It
Yeah.
was very fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.